Eleanor Washington looked at the clock in her office. Almost 7 in the evening, and she was finally done with her last case for the day. The courthouse had emptied hours ago, leaving behind that distinct smell of old paper and floor polish that she'd grown to associate with justice. She rubbed her tired eyes and closed the thick case file on her desk. Being a judge wasn't just about wearing a black robe and banging a gavel. It was late nights like this, reviewing evidence, reading testimonies, and making sure every decision was fair and followed the law. Eleanor hadn't always sat on this side of the courtroom. Growing up in South Chicago, life hadn't been easy. Her mom worked 2 jobs, and her dad drove a city bus. They lived in a small apartment where Eleanor shared a bedroom with her 2 sisters. But what they lacked in money, they made up for with books. Eleanor's parents filled their home with books from library sales and thrift stores, and Eleanor read them all. "You're going to be somebody," her mother always told her. "You just keep reading those books." And read she did. All the way through high school, where she graduated top of her class. All the way through college on a scholarship. All the way through law school, where she sometimes felt like the only black woman in a sea of white faces. 20 years of hard work later, and now people called her Your Honor. Eleanor packed her briefcase and switched off her desk lamp. The courthouse was quiet now, just the sound of the night janitor's vacuum in the distance. She nodded at him as she walked past. "Working late again, Judge Washington?" he asked with a smile. "Always, Mr. Chen," she replied. "Those cases won't review themselves." Outside, the spring evening was cool and clear. Stars were just starting to appear in the darkening sky. Eleanor took a deep breath of fresh air. After a long day of courtroom stuffiness, it felt good. As she walked to her car in the nearly empty parking lot, her phone buzzed. It was her sister Denise. "Please tell me you're not still at work," Denise said when Eleanor answered. Eleanor laughed. "Just leaving now." "You know it's Friday, right? Normal people have fun on Fridays." "I'll have you know I have very exciting plans," Eleanor said, unlocking her car. "A glass of wine and those legal briefs I didn't get to today." Denise groaned. "You're hopeless. When was the last time you went on a date, or even saw a movie?" Eleanor slid into the driver's seat. "I saw plenty of drama in my courtroom today. A movie would be boring after that." They chatted as Eleanor pulled out of the parking lot. Denise had 3 kids and always had funny stories about them. Tonight it was about her youngest, Zoe, who had decided to give the family dog a haircut. "I swear that poor dog looks like he got in a fight with a lawnmower," Denise laughed. Eleanor was still smiling when she hung up. Family kept her grounded, reminded her why her work mattered. Driving through downtown, she passed the bright lights of restaurants filled with people starting their weekend. Sometimes she wondered what a normal 9-to-5 job would be like. More sleep, probably. But she wouldn't trade her job for anything. Even on the hardest days, when she had to sentence someone to prison, or when lawyers tried to talk over her, or when some people looked surprised to see a black woman behind the bench, even then, she knew she was exactly where she was supposed to be. What Eleanor didn't know, as she drove home that evening, was that her position as a judge was about to be tested in a way she never expected. She didn't know that within the hour, everything would change. She didn't see the police car parked in the shadows up ahead, or the officer inside watching her car approach with narrowed eyes. She didn't know that Officer Thomas Rollins had already decided who she was before he ever saw her face. Thomas Rollins sat in his patrol car, eyes fixed on the road ahead. 15 years on the force, and he still got that rush when he spotted a target. He tapped his fingers on the steering wheel, waiting. His police radio crackled with chatter, but he wasn't really listening. The evening shift was usually quiet in this part of town, too quiet for his taste. He preferred action, confrontation, something to break up the monotony. The dashboard computer glowed blue in the darkness. If anyone looked at his record, they'd see a cop with impressive numbers. Over 200 arrests last year alone, more than anyone else in his precinct. What the numbers didn't show were the complaints filed against him, 7 for excessive force, 12 for racial profiling. None of those complaints stuck. Rollins had a knack for making problems disappear. A changed report here, a lost piece of evidence there. And he had friends in the right places, fellow officers who would back his version of events, supervisors who looked the other way because his arrest numbers made the department look good. "These streets need cleaning up," he often said in the break room. "Someone's got to do the dirty work." Some of the younger officers looked up to him. Others kept their distance. Officer Patel had once reported him for making racist comments during an arrest. The next week, Patel found his locker broken into, his family photo smashed. No one ever figured out who did it. Rollins sipped his now-cold coffee and grimaced. His ex-wife had called again this morning, demanding the child support payment he was late on. Third time this month. He'd have to deal with that eventually, but right now, he had other things on his mind. Like the fact that Captain Wilson had called him in yesterday about another complaint. Some college kid claimed Rollins had roughed him up for no reason during a traffic stop. This is the third complaint this month, Rollins, the captain had said, not quite meeting his eyes. "I can only cover for you so many times." But Rollins wasn't worried. Wilson was weak, afraid of bad publicity. He'd talk tough in private, then sign off on whatever report Rollins put in front of him. A car turned onto the street, catching Rollins' attention. Nice car. Too nice for this neighborhood. Probably some rich kids slumming it to buy drugs, he thought. Or maybe someone who took a wrong turn. He watched as the car approached, driving just under the speed limit. The driver was being careful. Too careful, maybe. Suspicious. Rollins straightened up in his seat. He could always find a reason to pull someone over. A taillight that looked dim from certain angles. A slightly delayed stop at a sign. Or his personal favorite, claiming they matched the description of a suspect. No one could prove they didn't. His mind flashed back to the morning briefing. Lieutenant Brooks going on about community relations and building trust. What a joke. The streets weren't cleaned up by building trust. They were cleaned up by putting the right people in handcuffs. And Rollins had a talent for knowing who the right people were. At least in his mind. The approaching car slowed slightly at a yellow light, then continued through. Rollins smiled. Technically legal, but it gave him an opening. He reached for the ignition. Tonight had been boring so far, but maybe that was about to change. Maybe he'd find something, or someone, to make his shift more interesting. What Rollins didn't know was that the driver of that car wasn't some kid buying drugs or a lost tourist. He didn't know that his next traffic stop would be the biggest mistake of his career. He didn't know that the woman behind the wheel had sent men like him to prison before, from the other side of a judge's bench. He didn't know, as he pulled out to follow her, that karma was about to catch up with him in the most unexpected way. Eleanor was thinking about the case she'd just finished as she drove home. A young man accused of robbery who might have just been in the wrong place at the wrong time. The evidence wasn't strong enough, and she dismissed the case earlier that day. The relief on his mother's face had stayed with Eleanor all afternoon. The flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror snapped her out of her thoughts. Eleanor checked her speed. She was going just under the limit. She hadn't run any stop signs or red lights. For a moment, she thought the police car would pass her, chasing someone else. But the lights stayed right behind her. With a sigh, Eleanor put on her blinker and pulled over to the side of the road. She'd been pulled over before. As a black woman driving a nice car, it happened more often than she liked to admit. Even with her judge's credentials, some things never changed. She did what her father had taught her years ago, turned off the engine, placed her hands on the steering wheel at 10 and 2, and waited. Her heart beat a little faster despite herself. The police officer took his time approaching. Eleanor watched in her side mirror as he finally stepped up to her window, one hand resting near his gun. She rolled down her window. "License and registration," Officer Rollins said, not bothering with a greeting. His flashlight beam hit her directly in the eyes, making her squint. "May I ask why I've been pulled over?" Eleanor asked calmly, still keeping her hands visible on the wheel. "You went through a yellow light back there," Rollins said. "Almost red. Pretty reckless driving." Eleanor blinked in surprise. "Officer, I'm certain I went through on yellow, which is legal. I was well within the speed limit too." "Ma'am, I need your license and registration now," Rollins repeated, his voice hardening. "Not your opinion on how you were driving." Eleanor nodded. "My purse is in the passenger seat. I'm going to reach for it now, okay?" She moved slowly, pulling out her wallet. Along with her driver's license, she also took out her judicial ID. She handed both to the officer. I'm Judge Eleanor Washington from the 3rd District Court, she said. I was just leaving work at the courthouse. Rollins glanced at the IDs, then looked back at her with narrowed eyes. Right, and I'm the president. He shined his flashlight around the inside of her car. Have you been drinking tonight, ma'am? Excuse me. Eleanor couldn't hide her shock. No, of course not. Officer Rollins, she said, reading his name tag. I don't appreciate your tone or implication. That is my judicial ID. You can call the courthouse to verify my identity. Step out of the car, please, Rollins said suddenly. I don't understand why that's necessary. I smell alcohol. Step out of the car now. His hand moved closer to his weapon. Eleanor knew she hadn't been drinking. There was nothing to smell. But she also knew that arguing with an officer like this could be dangerous. Slowly, she unbuckled her seatbelt. I want to call the police chief, she said. Paul Reynolds is a colleague of mine. Oh, you're on a first-name basis with the chief, are you? Rollins scoffed. That's a new one. Eleanor stepped out of her car, standing straight and looking Rollins in the eye. Officer, I understand you're doing your job, but there's been a misunderstanding. I've been in court all day. I haven't had anything to drink, and I wasn't driving improperly. A few cars drove by slowly, their drivers watching the scene with curiosity. A young couple had stopped on the sidewalk nearby, the woman holding up her phone as if recording. Turn around and put your hands on the vehicle, Rollins ordered, ignoring Eleanor's explanation. This is unnecessary. I'm reaching for my phone to call Chief Reynolds, Eleanor said, moving her hand toward her coat pocket. What happened next would change both their lives forever. Don't reach, Rollins shouted, grabbing her arm roughly. That's resisting. In seconds, Eleanor found herself pushed against her own car, the cool metal of handcuffs closing around her wrists, and the weight of 15 years of unchecked power pressing down on her shoulders. You have the right to remain silent, Rollins said, his voice loud enough for the growing crowd of onlookers to hear. He tightened the handcuffs around Eleanor's wrists, making her wince. This is completely unnecessary, Eleanor said, trying to keep her voice steady despite the anger and humiliation she felt. I am a judge. You can verify that with one phone call. Sure you are, Rollins replied with a smirk. And I'm sure the drugs I'm going to find in this vehicle belong to someone else, right? Eleanor's eyes widened. Drugs? There are no drugs in my car. This is harassment, Officer Rollins, and it's all being recorded. She nodded toward the young couple on the sidewalk. The woman was definitely filming now, and several other cars had pulled over. At least 5 people had their phones out, capturing the scene. Rollins glanced at the bystanders, a flash of uncertainty crossing his face before he doubled down. Step away from the vehicle. I'm going to search it. You do not have my consent to search my car, Eleanor said firmly. You have no probable cause. I told you I smelled alcohol, which gives me probable cause. Now you're interfering with an investigation. Rollins grabbed her arm and pulled her roughly toward his patrol car. Hey, someone shouted from the crowd. You don't need to be so rough with her. Stay back. Rollins yelled, his hand moving to his weapon. Everyone stay back or you'll be arrested for interfering. The crowd quieted but didn't disperse. More phones came out. More witnesses. More evidence. Eleanor kept her head high as Rollins pushed her into the back seat of his patrol car. She had represented clients who'd been wrongfully arrested. She had sentenced officers who'd abused their power, but she never thought she would experience it firsthand. My judicial badge is in my purse, along with my bar card, she said calmly. Call the courthouse. Call Chief Reynolds. This mistake is only getting worse for you. Rollins slammed the door without responding and walked back to search her car. Through the window, Eleanor could see him rifling through her belongings, tossing her carefully organized legal papers onto the passenger seat. He opened her glove compartment, checked under the seats, and even popped open her trunk. After finding nothing, he returned to the patrol car and got in the driver's seat. Finding it hard to plant evidence with so many cameras on you? Eleanor asked quietly. Rollins' knuckles whitened as he gripped the steering wheel. One more word, and I'll add threatening an officer to your charges. What charges exactly? Eleanor asked. Going through a yellow light? Being black in a nice car? Or is it the made-up DUI you're after? Rollins started the engine and pulled away from the curb. In the side mirror, Eleanor could see people following in their cars, still recording. A small comfort, but a comfort nonetheless. At the police station, Rollins roughly guided Eleanor through the back entrance, away from the front desk where other officers might recognize her. The handcuffs bit into her wrists as he pushed her down a hallway. "Processing is backed up," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Might be a few hours before we get to you." "Officer Lee." Eleanor called out to a young officer passing by. The man stopped, looking confused. "I'm Judge Washington from the 3rd District. Please call Chief Reynolds immediately." Officer Lee's eyes widened in recognition, but before he could respond, Rollins cut in. "She's drunk and disorderly. Claims to be a judge to get special treatment. I'll handle it." Lee hesitated, looking between them. Are you really Judge Washington, the one who handled the West Side corruption case?" Eleanor nodded. "The very same. And I'm being unlawfully detained by your colleague here." Something shifted in the air. Other officers nearby had stopped to listen. Rollins' face reddened as he realized his mistake was beginning to unravel in front of his peers. "I need to make a phone call," Eleanor said, addressing everyone in the hallway now. "As is my right. And I suggest someone start reviewing Officer Rollins' body camera footage immediately." Rollins' hand tightened on her arm, one last show of power, before the weight of his mistake finally began to sink in. The holding cell was cold and smelled of bleach and sweat. Eleanor sat on the metal bench, her back straight despite her exhaustion. She'd been here for nearly 3 hours now. Her requests to make a phone call had been ignored. Her judicial ID was being verified, a stalling tactic if she'd ever seen one. Across from her, a young woman with bloodshot eyes kept glancing her way. "You don't look like you belong here," the woman finally said. Eleanor gave her a small smile. "None of us belong here until we've been proven guilty in a court of law." The woman laughed. "You sound like a lawyer." "Judge, actually." The woman's eyes widened. "For real? And they got you in here. What did you do? Give someone too harsh a sentence?" "I drove while black," Eleanor said simply. "Wrong place, wrong time, wrong officer." Before the woman could respond, the door to the holding area opened. Captain Rivera, a veteran officer Eleanor knew from several court cases, stood there looking mortified. "Judge Washington," he said, his voice a mix of shock and embarrassment. "My God, what are you doing in here?" Eleanor stood up. "Hello, Captain. I was hoping someone would recognize me eventually." Rivera rushed forward, keys jangling in his hand. I don't even know what to say. Who brought you in?" "Officer Thomas Rollins. He didn't believe I was a judge, claimed I was intoxicated, and arrested me during a traffic stop. He's had my credentials for 3 hours." The captain's face darkened. "Rollins." Of course it was Rollins. He unlocked the cell door. "Please come with me immediately. Chief Reynolds is on his way." As they walked through the station, officers stopped and stared. Word had spread quickly. Some looked horrified, others embarrassed. A few couldn't meet Eleanor's eyes at all. In the captain's office, Eleanor was finally able to call her sister Denise. "They did, Barbara. Denise's voice was so loud that Eleanor had to hold the phone away from her ear. "I'm coming down there right now. I'm bringing Uncle Harold too." Uncle Harold was their mother's brother, a civil rights attorney who'd fought police brutality cases for 30 years. "Stay calm," Eleanor said, though her own anger was simmering just below the surface. "I'm being released. We'll handle this properly." After ending the call, Eleanor noticed several notifications on her phone. The videos of her arrest had already gone viral. Local news stations were calling for comments. Her phone buzzed with a text from a reporter she knew. "Judge Washington, is it true you were wrongfully arrested tonight? We're running the story at 11. Captain Rivera returned with a cup of tea. "Judge Washington, I cannot express how deeply sorry the department is for this incident. Chief Reynolds will be here in 10 minutes. "Captain, I want to see Officer Rollins' body camera footage," Eleanor said, setting down her phone. "And I want to know where he is now." "He's been confined to a desk. His body cam has been secured as evidence." Rivera hesitated. "There's something else you should know. We looked into his record after this incident. There's a pattern of complaints against him that seems to have been overlooked." "Overlooked?" Eleanor raised an eyebrow, or deliberately ignored. Rivera had the decency to look ashamed. The system failed. I failed. We should have addressed his behavior long before tonight. The door opened and Chief Reynolds entered, his face grim. He'd known Eleanor for years. They'd worked on a police reform committee together last year. Eleanor, he said, forgetting formalities in his distress. This should never have happened. I've already started an internal investigation. Paul, Eleanor replied evenly. This goes beyond an internal investigation. Officer Rollins violated my civil rights. He detained me without cause, refused to verify my identity, denied me my phone call, and left me in a cell for 3 hours. And the truly disturbing part, I'm a judge. I had resources and connections. What happens to the people who don't? The chief nodded slowly. You're right. This needs to be handled differently. He pulled up a chair. Tell me exactly what happened. Every detail. As Eleanor recounted the events of the evening, she could see the realization dawning on both men's faces. This wasn't just about one bad officer or one wrongful arrest. It was about a system that had allowed someone like Rollins to abuse his power for years. Outside the office, officers gathered, whispering among themselves. Through the glass, Eleanor could see Rollins sitting alone at a desk, his face pale as the consequences of his actions began crashing down around him. By morning, the story was everywhere. Judge wrongfully arrested, police department under fire. Eleanor's phone wouldn't stop ringing. News stations wanted interviews. Civil rights groups offered support. Fellow judges called to express their outrage. Eleanor sat in her kitchen, nursing a cup of coffee as her sister Denise and Uncle Harold discussed legal strategy at her dining table. You could sue for millions, Uncle Harold said, his reading glasses perched on the end of his nose as he reviewed the case notes. After 40 years of fighting civil rights cases, he knew exactly how to approach this. False arrest, racial profiling, excessive force. The videos make it clear-cut. I don't want money, Eleanor said, looking out her window at the news vans parked along her street. I want change. Denise squeezed her hand. You barely slept last night. How are you holding up? Eleanor sighed. I keep thinking about that girl in the holding cell with me. How many others like her are there? People without my connections, my resources? The doorbell rang. It was District Attorney Patricia Chen, a former law school classmate of Eleanor's. I came as soon as I could, Patricia said, giving Eleanor a brief hug. The mayor's office is in chaos. The police union is scrambling. Everyone wants to know what you're going to do. What I'm going to do? Eleanor raised an eyebrow. You're the victim here, but you're also a respected judge, Patricia explained. Your next move will set the tone for everything that follows. She placed a folder on the coffee table. I've already started reviewing Officer Rollins' past arrests. The pattern is disturbing. Uncle Harold leaned forward. How disturbing? In the past 3 years, 87% of his discretionary arrests were of people of color, Patricia said. Multiple excessive force complaints that were dismissed, and we found at least 3 cases where evidence may have been planted. Eleanor's phone buzzed with a news alert. The police chief was about to hold a press conference. They turned on the TV just as Chief Reynolds approached a podium crowded with microphones. Last night, an unacceptable incident occurred involving one of our officers and a respected member of our judiciary, the chief began, his face sullen. Judge Eleanor Washington was wrongfully detained during a routine traffic stop. Let me be clear, this should never have happened. The camera cut to shots of protesters gathering outside the police station, holding signs that read "Justice for Judge Washington" and "Who polices the police?" Effective immediately, Officer Thomas Rollins has been placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation, the chief continued. We are reviewing all body camera footage as well as Officer Rollins' prior conduct and arrest record. A reporter shouted, "Is this case being treated differently because the victim is a judge?" The chief paused. This case has brought to light issues that deserve attention regardless of who the victim is. But yes, Judge Washington's position has made this incident more visible. And perhaps that visibility will finally lead to the changes many have been calling for. Eleanor turned off the TV. He's right about one thing. This happened to get attention because of who I am. That's the problem. Patricia nodded. So what do you want to do about it? Eleanor stood up and walked to the bookshelf, running her finger along the spines of law books she'd collected over decades. She pulled out one on police accountability that she'd helped author 5 years ago. I want complete transparency, she said. I want Rollins' full record reviewed publicly. I want an independent commission to examine every complaint filed against him that was dismissed. That won't be easy, Uncle Harold warned. The police union will fight it. Could, Eleanor said, a new determination in her voice. Let them fight it in the open, where everyone can see. No more closed-door meetings, no more buried complaints. Denise smiled at her sister. You've got that look. The one you get before you make a landmark ruling. Eleanor nodded. Tomorrow, I'll hold my own press conference. This isn't just about me and Rollins anymore. This is about fixing a broken system. Outside, more news vans were arriving. Eleanor's phone rang again, the mayor this time, probably trying to contain the damage. But Eleanor wasn't interested in containment. For the first time since the whole ordeal began, she felt a sense of purpose. What happened to her was wrong, but maybe, just maybe, it could lead to something right. 2 years had passed since that fateful night. Eleanor Washington stood at the courthouse steps, surrounded by reporters and community members. Behind her, a diverse group of officials waited, the new police chief, city council members, and representatives from the Civilian Oversight Board that Eleanor had helped create. Today marks a new chapter in our city's history, Eleanor said into the microphones. The Accountability in Policing Act goes into effect citywide. Every officer will now wear body cameras that cannot be turned off during interactions with the public. Every complaint will be reviewed by an independent panel of citizens. And perhaps most importantly, officers with multiple complaints will no longer be protected by silence and paperwork. The crowd applauded. Among them stood the young woman Eleanor had met in the holding cell that night, now working as a community liaison for the Police Reform Committee. Later that afternoon, Eleanor settled into her judge's chair in courtroom 5B. The case before her was routine, a dispute between neighbors over property lines. She listened patiently to both sides, taking notes, asking questions. This was the work she loved, the daily application of justice. As the last case wrapped up, her clerk handed her a file. Final case of the day, Your Honor. Eleanor opened it and felt a jolt of recognition. The defendant's name was familiar, Thomas Rollins. When the bailiff called the case, Rollins entered the courtroom. He looked different, thinner, grayer, his former confidence gone. He glanced up at Eleanor, then quickly looked away. Mr. Rollins, Eleanor said, keeping her voice neutral. You're here on charges of evidence tampering, filing false police reports, and civil rights violations. These charges stem from an investigation that reviewed your conduct over the past 5 years on the force. Rollins' lawyer stood. Your Honor, given your history with my client, we request that you recuse yourself from this case. Eleanor had expected this. Counselor, I've reviewed this matter carefully with the Judicial Ethics Committee. The charges against your client relate to multiple cases spanning years, not just my personal experience. However, I understand your concern about impartiality. She looked directly at Rollins for the first time in 2 years. Mr. Rollins, you have the right to request another judge. The decision is yours. The courtroom was silent. Rollins conferred with his lawyer, then stood. No, Your Honor. I want you to hear this case. His voice was quiet, different from the arrogant tone she remembered. I think you'll be fair. Fairer than I was. Eleanor nodded. Very well. How do you plead? Guilty, Your Honor, Rollins said, to all charges. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The prosecutor looked surprised. They'd expected a fight. Mr. Rollins has agreed to testify against others in the department who covered up misconduct, his lawyer added. As part of his plea agreement, Eleanor studied the man before her. The system that had enabled him had been changed, partly because of what he'd done to her. There was a certain symmetry to it all. I'll review the plea agreement, Eleanor said. Sentencing will be scheduled for next month. After the courtroom cleared, Eleanor sat alone at her bench. Her phone buzzed with a text from Denise. Did he show? Eleanor replied, yes, pled guilty to everything. A moment later, another text. Karma. Sweet, sweet karma. But Elena didn't see it as karma. She saw it as something better, progress. Real change rarely came from revenge, but from reform, from hard work and persistence. That evening, Eleanor visited her parents for dinner, as she did every Friday. Her father grilled chicken in the backyard, while her mother prepared a salad. They didn't talk about Rawlins or the case or the new police oversight board. Instead, they talked about normal things: her nephew's school play, her mother's garden, her father's bowling league. As Eleanor helped clear the table after dinner, her mother squeezed her hand. "You know what your grandmother used to say? Justice moves slow, but it doesn't stop moving." Eleanor smiled. She was right. And in a courtroom across town, an empty holding cell stood clean and monitored, its occupants now granted their phone calls promptly, their rights respected, their humanity acknowledged, small changes that rippled outward from one terrible night when the wrong officer had arrested the right judge.